Over all these thoughts I skimmed rapidly, for another inquiry demanded my attention more imperiously, the inquiry which on previous occasions I had postponed, into the cause of this felicity which I had just experienced, into the character of the certitude with which it imposed itself. In this cause I began to divine as I compared these diverse happy impressions, diverse yet with this in common, that I experienced them at the present moment, and at the same time in the context of a distant moment, so that the past was made to encroach upon the present, and I was made to doubt whether I was in the one or the other. The truth surely was that the being within me, which had enjoyed these impressions, had enjoyed them because they had in them something that was common to a day long past and to the present, because in some way they were extra-temporal. And this being made its appearance only when, through one of these identifications of the present with the past, it was likely to find itself in the one and only medium in which it could exist and enjoy the essence of things. That is to say, outside time. This explained why it was that my anxiety on the subject of my death had ceased at the moment when I had unconsciously recognized the taste of that little Madeleine, since the being which at that moment I had been was an extra-temporal being, and therefore unalarmed by the vicissitudes of the future. This being had only come to me, only manifested itself outside of activity and immediate enjoyment, on those rare occasions when the miracle of an analogy had made me escape from the present. And only this being had the power to perform that task which had always defeated the efforts of my memory and my intellect. The power to make me rediscover days that were long past, the time that was lost. Hey, this is Nathan.
This is David.
And this is Nick. You're listening to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast, where today we are wrapping up the journey through Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, this time talking about the last volume, Time Regained. We're reading the Modern Library edition. That's a translation by Mayer and Kilmartin. And a disclaimer that I guess we've said at the beginning of every one, so we might as well say it again, is that sometimes we pronounce French words incorrectly. If you've come with us this far, it's not a surprise. So it goes. To bring this one home.
Bring it home, Nick.
A summary. So we are dropped into the beginning of this one. We have the narrator who's hanging out with Gilbert and Cambrai, and they go on walks. And I guess the big thing that happens initially is that his mind is just blown when he finds out that Swann's Way and the Guermantes Way are not as irreconcilable as he once thought.
Can you pause for a second? Where did the last book end?
I don't know.
I mean, just roughly. Are they married yet?
What? They never got married. What are you talking about?
Gilbert and St. Luc.
She's married to Robert St. Luc.
That happened in the last book.
Yeah.
Yes.
Who's the... Yeah. Is this an outtake? What is this?
What's that funny?
All right, let's start over.
Did you read this book?
At the end of the last book...
Every book, I'm like, wait, what happened? We need a recap.
At the end of the last book...
Don't y'all watch TV?
Albertine died, and...
Remember, and then they all got married to different people. There was like...
Everybody got married to different people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That was pretty much it.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we were dropped into the beginning of this. We have the narrator hanging out with Gilbert and Cambrai. They go on walks, and I guess the big point of the initial thing is that his mind is blown when he finds out that Swann's Way and the Guermantes Way are effectively not as irreconcilable as he once thought, which we'll see where this leads, but I guess in a physical sense, it means that they lead the same place. Is that the takeaway as they're going on strolls, which kind of...
Well, I think the main takeaway, and he kind of talks about it, and it sets up pretty much one of the biggest themes of this book in particular, is the discrepancies in memory and how one reconciles with those things.
Right. So, could have had a map, could have gotten there faster, but here we are. Gilbert releases some kind of nuggets about the past. She says that she was into the narrator when they were really young. And there's this vulgar, suggestive sign that she makes to him, which I didn't quite place in my head what that's supposed to be. It actually does show up in the film, which we can talk about, the Time Regained adaptation. I actually sort of forget. I don't know. I can't make it with my hand, but I think it's supposed to be vaguely sexual, I guess.
Oh, like a hand gesture.
I thought she just winked at him or something.
I think she makes a hand gesture.
Oh.
And the old finger
It's not like it's not like a 90s Adam Sandler movie, so it's not like
okay.
that blunt. But I think it is meant to be sort of like a suggestive thing.
Okay.
So next thing, we get a little nugget about how when the narrator way back when was sort of mad at Gilbert for walking with a boy, and he's like, I want nothing else to do with you. It turns out that boy was in fact Leah walking with Gilbert. So nice little...
Who is the famous lesbian actress? Was that we met in the last...
You talking about Rachel?
Volume? No, Leah.
Leah's not an actress, is she?
I thought she was.
I don't know.
I'm just giving a little context here because she's famously a lesbian, though.
I think she's famously a lesbian. I don't think she's an actress.
Yeah.
Is she? Did I miss that?
Could be.
I thought
Who
she
knows?
was, but
my memory is not reliable.
Oh, hey.
Continuing on, picking up steam. We have what I think is kind of the most important first step into the whole concept of what this book is about, which is about literature. It's about memory. It's about documenting memories. We have the narrator reading a section from the Goncourt journal, which, I don't know, did you guys look this up at all? Which is basically like this really detailed kind of like document of society by the Goncourt brothers. It was just this like extensive diary that existed. And I think Proust basically, I don't think this is a section of the journal. I think he's making an example sort of play on it by creating his own specific one about the Verdurins.
But he's referencing something that actually existed.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
And yet it was, I couldn't imagine anyone wanting to read something like that.
Exactly. It's super detailed, super rough.
Super boring.
And that's why it's funny, because his reaction to it is like, oh, I'm so terrible at literature. Like, it makes him feel bad about his own thing. When in reality, I feel like he's sort of doing a very similar thing of just documenting like all of this stuff in like such hyper detail.
Also, he does that later in the book when he's talking about how he can no longer, do you remember the scene where he's like, I can no longer find beauty in nature, so I guess I can't use that as inspiration to write. I'll have to use people. And yet he's doing it in an incredibly poetic and amazing way.
Yeah. Yeah, he's really hard on himself for like large portions of this book.
But I loved that. And I love the...
You love the excerpt specifically, or his interpretation of it?
No, him revealing his insecurities and, whether or not that's good. Like, how do you know whether something is good? One way is public opinion. And so this is something that the public had confirmed is successful. This is what the public wants to read. And so when he sits down and he's not a writer yet, and he's saying like, I want to write a book. And this whole passage is like about him being completely turned off of literature, because he's like, literature for him, what he wanted literature to be was some high expression of truth beyond the surface details. And when he looked out and found, what the literature was of the day, and said, well, A, this isn't expressing truth, because I've met these people and they're not like that. This is bullshit. And B, I've tried to write like this and I can't do it. So I'm not measuring up to what society has told me literature needs to be. And so he has like a crisis. Like, I neither like literature nor am I capable of being a novelist.
Yeah. I'm just going to read a little bit of that passage. I'm jumping ahead to that train scene because I think it's very amusing. But Nathan, you're right. He kind of has this crisis of conscience, or this doubt about himself as capable of writing, and yet it's so he's such a good writer. It's ridiculous. I also really enjoyed him dumping all over socialist realism fiction. That was kind of fun.
Oh yeah, that was an awesome section. Just about the whole pushing of morals and how it's worthless, and that was fantastic.
It was great. But here, the train had stopped. I remember an open country. The sun was shining on a row of trees that followed the railway line, flooding the upper halves of their trunks with light. Trees, I thought. You no longer have anything to say to me. My heart has grown cold and no longer hears you. I am in the midst of nature. Well, it is with indifference, with boredom, that my eyes register the line which separates your radiant foreheads from your shadowy trunks. If ever I thought of myself as a poet, I know now that I am not one. Which is, he just described it so poetic. And he kind of goes on from there, talking about how he's not a worthy man of letters, but yeah, that's kind of a big theme of this last volume.
This spoke to me a lot, his self-deprecation, because what he's, I think, saying, or the conclusion that he comes to and through this book and reveals through this book, is that he, Marcel Proust, who we now revere as a great artist, could not produce art that mimicked other art. He had to find that truth in himself. So, and for him, when he describes nature so beautifully, and maybe you've had this experience, trying to mimic music or mimic photography or mimic painting or something like that, and you feel like you can't live up to someone who does it very well. But there's something about your experience that rings very true that you can't see. And him coming to this conclusion that, it's like, it's not obvious that dipping a Madeleine in a cup of tea has anything to do with art, has anything to do with poetry. That grove of trees at sunset, of course, that is art and that is poetry, and he can't find it within himself to describe it in a way that anybody would care about. And it wasn't until he could look at himself and look back at his experience and find like, oh, actually, it's this cookie in hot tea that is poetry for me, and I can describe that. It's those two specific trees on some carriage ride, and he felt like they were reaching out to him that he could describe poetically, or those hawthorns. But it's not just generally, it had to be rooted in his specific memory and experience, even if there was nobody confirming that was a poetic experience.
Yeah. And it kind of gets at what is such an important part of what he distinguishes later between intellectual and sort of spiritual truth. Mm-hmm. But anyway, Nick has still... We've yet to even get to the war, which his introduction of it is honestly amusing as hell.
Yeah. So, continuing on with the plot lines of a book that the plot doesn't matter as much, but hey, here we go. So now we're back in Paris, 1916, middle of the war. He's walking around at night, kind of reminds him of the countryside because it's, everything's all dark. He's basically reflecting on the changes of society, and one observation that I liked a lot that was a callback to everything Dreyfus related was that Dreyfusism is just an accepted thing now. It's no longer a novelty. It's no longer shocking. And everyone that was on either side of it has just sort of converged in having the same viewpoint. And people have even sort of used it in various ways in all different political directions. And so the point being is that like all of these things that seem like the biggest deal of all time, if you add time to it, they just sort of get normalized. And we just accept them. And so I'm sure you can look at any slice of, American history, call it the Vietnam War, call it civil rights movement, all that stuff, right? That was huge in the moment that we just sort of now look back on as this accepted specific thing. And so I thought that was an excellent observation about kind of the way like time essentially sort of erodes these differences and kind of creates this,
and how
this
like
converging point.
With the war and the view of Germany, it's like now you were supposed to feel one way or the other about Germany.
Yeah. You can't be whistling Schoenberg or whatever in the hallways like his friend was doing.
Yeah. And your former, opposition in the Dreyfus affair is now your ally, and your former ally in the Dreyfus affair is now your opposition because they're not as, hateful of Germany as society has deemed that they should be, or your portion of society is deemed that they should be.
I think time reveals the true expediency of politics, or at least politicians.
Yeah, exactly. It's just noise. Like there's a filtered thing beneath it, but like in the moment, it's just like a great thing to remember, especially as we go through like our daily tumultuous lifestyle of the news cycle.
Yeah. There's a line, I just want to read it just because I think it's amazing, and it gives evidence that Proust was a poet. And it's when he's actually describing returning to Paris. He says, "In this Paris, whose beauty in 1914 I had seen awaiting almost defenseless the threat of the approaching enemy, there was certainly, as there had been then, the ancient, unalterable splendor of a moon, cruelly and mysteriously serene, which poured down its useless beauty upon the still untouched buildings of the capital. I just really like that line, that's all.
Yeah, that's a great image.
Continuing on.
Can I just note his introduction to the war is by noting that the sanatorium he was at couldn't get enough staff in 1916.
Oh, I missed
and
that.
And he mentions that before he actually mentions the word war. So he's talking about, at this time I was at the sanitarium. Unfortunately, they couldn't hire enough good staff in 1916. So I went back to the city, and that's where I was listening to what everybody was talking about, the war.
Oh, well, that's...
I just thought it was such a funny way to like introduce this idea.
I mean, there's
Great
definitely
detail.
a lot of, there's a lot of time loops in this that I think are intended. And then there's a lot of time errors that I think are not intended. That's kind of one of the comments about like things that happened out of order. Sometimes it seemed like they were important, and other times it seemed like he just, didn't get a chance to wrap this up tightly.
That felt important to like, at least as a reader, to kind of get a better idea of his character. That the war, this great world war, the first, was kind of secondary to his personal needs.
I feel like it's also kind of similar to how he announced Swan's death, where like all of a sudden Swan was just dead. And then it was talked about in much more depth, but it just happened in a line.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And to get a sense of his status in society as amongst these elite and how they sort of view the war. There's that really great little scene where, I can't remember who it is, one of the Verderins has to like get a doctor to prescribe a restaurant to make her croissants.
Yeah.
And she's like reading about this boat sinking, but talking about how awful it is keeping one hand free so that she can eat and her croissant. I don't know, it's just so great.
Yeah. I don't know if this is before or after where we are, but I just like this observation. The public, after resisting the modernists of literature and art, is falling into line with the modernists of war, because it is an accepted fashion to think like this, and also because little minds are crushed, not by the beauty, but by the hugeness of the action.
It's like he was envisioning the rest of the 20th century.
He has a lot of great commentary on that stuff about how people who, only get their opinions from newspapers then like kind of just project them on and say statements in a certain way that make it sound like they're an authority on, movements of troops and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But it's all just fake. And it just reminds me of every conversation that I hear every day now.
Yeah,
where
everybody became a epidemiologist. And
yeah, exactly right. Yeah, think of the whole pandemic.
An expert on Ukrainian-Russian relations.
Yeah, right. I mean, we're just all making it up. It is the reality. So, picking back up, another thing that's happened is the Verderins are now cool people. That's the place to hang out. So, having thrown some time on it, stuff in society shifts, and now that's the cool spot.
Okay. I don't think we're there yet, but he mixes up the names a lot because people keep remarrying other people in this book. But the Verderins are still the same Verderins at this stage.
Yes. You're talking about how...
Because she becomes...
a German.
The German.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I was getting very cross-eyed.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's continued overlaps.
Okay.
So now there's a callback to a previous, because we went from 1916 and now it goes back a couple years, and he's thinking about St. Loup in 1914, and that's when he's talking about wanting to enlist, specifically wanting to go to the front. He's talking military strategy and kind of the beauty and all that stuff behind it. He goes back to the sanatorium and then back to Paris, and this gets into some of my favorite stuff, which is hanging out with Charlot, who now just doesn't give a shit about anything. And whether that's like comments about like Germany, whether that's like his sexual excesses, like he's just like open loop. He's unbridled. But there's this awesome section in there where it talks about how his intellect is sort of passed over now. Like there's no room for it. And he's just labeled pre-war. Like people won't even give it the depth to understand what he's talking about. He's basically just been relegated to the dustbin of history. And that, to me, also resonated with how quickly we push aside people of past generations and decide that current generation knows what's best.
Wait, did you say Charlou?
Charlou.
Oh, okay, I thought you said
Saint Lou?
St. Lou. Charlou. Yeah,
We're on
sorry, I
Charlou.
was confused.
But then there's also stuff where he's still super pissed at Morel, right? So we get that in play.
And plots to murder him?
Yeah, there's a whole section about, actually I don't know exactly where this lands, but where Morel talks about how being the main thing that he doesn't want to see Charlou again is because he's scared. It's not because of honor. It's not because of any of that stuff. It's because he's actually just like worried for his life.
Yeah.
Yeah, Charlou doesn't give a shit about anything. Also, fun fact, John Malkovich plays Charlou in the adaptation.
Interesting choice.
What is this adaptation?
1999 flick, Time Regained. It's the only adaptation of the last volume. It's actually pretty great, but maybe not standalone.
In French or in
It's
English?
in French. Malkovich is a fluent French speaker, apparently.
Malkovich speaking French?
Yeah.
Huh.
So,
I'm going to have to watch that maybe this evening.
So continuing on, the narrator is now walking by himself. It's blacked out. He notices this suspicious person, this suspicious building. He's kind of like, what's going on there? Turns out that it's this house of male prostitution. Somehow Jupian is running it. Like, I don't understand how that happened, but he is. And this is where Charlou is just, going basically full BDSM, where he's paying soldiers / prostitutes of...
Wait. But our narrator decides he's going to be like a hero because he overhears these soldiers talking about this person who's clearly held captive against their will and getting the shit beat out of him. And he's like, I need to go see what's going on or alert the police or something.
Yeah, then he spies on him through a room and is like, what? What's going on here?
Which,
Charlou.
Luckily there was a window with a curtain open
exactly.
so he can watch.
Maybe that's
a little too convenient.
Yeah.
Also, this dude just happens to stumble upon all sorts of homoerotic instances.
Coincidentally.
Yeah, I mean...
Just coincidentally. You know how it is when you're walking around.
When you're walking around Paris at night alone.
Yeah.
I also like where he's basically turning down people that can't play the part as well as he wants them. Like, he wants them to be sort of criminals. He wants them to be thugs. He wants them to be tough. And so people are trying to play into that, but they're not true enough. It's not as authentic enough of an experience for Charlou.
But okay, Charlou, yeah.
I just, honestly, I was not expecting this book to be so open about homosexuality midway through, but I was also not expecting it to go into,
sadomasochism?
Yeah, essentially, right. That really surprised me. And I think it's badass. Because, I think we carry around ideas of what books are. We know that there's, stuff in Henry Miller. We know that there's stuff in Joyce. We know that, Lady Chatterley's Lover's got a lot of sex in it, right? But I never got that impression about In Search of Lost Time. I never thought it had this stuff in it.
Nobody made it this far.
Exactly. And I think there's something very badass about that. To this is a book that is so deep, but if you make it far enough, you get into BDSM.
Yeah.
It's literally on page 4,200.
That's what happens when you get to the end of time. It's just...
You meet your maker or your dominatrix.
You get chained to a steel bed and get whipped by a person dressed as a soldier.
Continuing on, we have Saint Loup gets killed at the front, which I guess is sort of what he wanted, or maybe not what he wanted. This is discussed. Morel gets arrested for being a deserter and then somehow implicates Charlou, and then Charlou gets arrested.
Yeah,
he sort of blames being a deserter on these indecent things that happened to him via Charlou, and so basically continued strife amongst Morel and Charlou. We're going to fast forward in time now, and he is at the Germain place, and this is basically where the whole thesis of the book comes together, because he steps on some uneven stones, and he is boom. He's thinking memories, thinking Madeleines, thinking musical passages from the Vintoul piece. And this is basically the best section of the book. And I think I've heard people mention saying that this last volume of Proust has a section of the best writing you'll ever experience. And it's basically this.
Yeah, it's pretty much from like page 254 to like 300 or so. It's just nothing but sticks of dynamite.
Yeah.
On everything that you just mentioned: time, fate, memory, art.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Every single thing is quoted. I'm sure we're just going to read a bunch. But essentially, I'll try to summarize. The thesis of the book in this section is basically regarding literature. David, you mentioned this earlier, but it's not really an intellectual exercise. It's meant to be a spiritual one. And if you treat it as such, it's capable of invoking memory and effectively allowing you to capture lost time, to essentially be outside of time. And effectively, this is where he realizes that this is his destiny in life. And he's going to express this and do this as fully as possible. Which, to your point, Nathan, early on, when he was super down on himself and self-deprecating about, like, oh, I'm terrible at literature, I can't do this, this is what society wants. It's kind of where he gets, like, re-engaged. And from there on out, this becomes his one and only mission.
And those, he also mentions, like, those moments of happenstance, the Madeline, the uneven stones, the hawthorns. He talks about how a true artist sort of discovers these things and allows it to move through him and not allow his intellect to sort of get in the way of that.
Shall we read a quote?
Oh, that's too many.
So here's one about how he's looking to capture these impressions or moments. He says, this is on 271, "Impressions such as those to which I wished to give permanence could not but vanish at the touch of a direct enjoyment which had been powerless to engender them. The only way to savor them more fully was to try to get to know them more completely in the medium in which they existed. That is to say, within myself, to try to make them translucid even to their very depths." So a lot of this is about the memory is important, but unless you're willing to explore that memory and find something in it, or that memory serves a purpose, and that purpose is to be walked into and explored and relived.
Here's an expansion on that thought, I think, on the following page. "For the truths which the intellect apprehends directly in the world of full and unimpeded light have something less profound, less necessary, than those which life communicates to us against our will in an impression which is material because it enters us through the senses, but yet has a spiritual meaning which it is possible for us to extract."
Should I try a long one? "The thought there is a vast difference between the real impression which we have had of a thing and the artificial impression of it which we form for ourselves, when we attempt by an act of will to imagine it, did not long detain me. Remembering with what relative indifference Swann years ago had been able to speak of the days when he had been loved, because what he saw beneath the words was not in fact those days but something else, and on the other hand the sudden pain which he had been caused by the little phrase of Vintu, when it gave him back the days themselves, just as they were when he had felt them in the past, I understood clearly that what the sensation of the uneven paving stones, the stiffness of the napkin, the taste of the Madeleine, had reawakened in me had no connection with what I frequently tried to recall to myself of Venice, Balbec, Cambrai, with the help of an undifferentiated memory, and I understood that the reason why life may be judged to be trivial, although at certain moments it seems to us beautiful, as that we form our judgment ordinarily on the evidence not of life itself, but of those quite different images which preserve nothing of life, and therefore we judge it disparagingly. At most I notice cursorily that the differences which exist between every one of our real impressions, differences which explain why a uniform depiction of life cannot bear much resemblance to the reality, derive probably from the following cause. The slightest word that we have said, the most insignificant action that we have performed at any one epoch of our life, was surrounded by, and colored by, the reflection of, things which logically had no connection with it, and which later have been separated from it by our intellect, which could make nothing of them for its own rational purposes. Things, however, in the midst of which, here the pink reflection of the evening upon the flowered-covered wall of a country restaurant, a feeling of hunger, the desire for women, the pleasure of luxury. There the blue volutes of the morning sea, and, enveloped in them, phrases of music half emerging like the shoulders of water-nymphs. The simplest act or gesture remains immured as within 1,000 sealed vessels, each one of them filled with things of a color, a scent, a temperature that are absolutely different from one another. Vessels, moreover, which being disposed over the whole range of our years, during which we have never ceased to change if only in our dreams and our thoughts, are situated at the most various moral altitudes, and give us the sensation of extraordinarily diverse atmospheres. It is true that we have accomplished these changes imperceptibly, but between the memory which brusquely returns to us and our present state, and no less between two memories of different years, places, hours, the distance is such that it alone, even without any specific originality, would make it impossible to compare one with the other. Yes, if owing to the work of oblivion, the returning memory can throw no bridge, form no connecting link between itself and the present minute, if it remains in the context of its own place and date, if it keeps its distance, its isolation in the hollow of a valley, or upon the highest peak of a mountain summit, for this very reason it causes us suddenly to breathe a new air, an air which is new precisely because we have breathed it in the past, the purer air, which the poets have vainly tried to situate in paradise, and which could induce so profound a sensation of renewal only if it had been breathed before, since the true paradises are the paradises that we have lost. Sorry, that was long.
That was excellent.
But that is like one of my favorite passages of this entire novel. All pages, all books. I really like that. And it really captures exactly everything he's trying to do about capturing these impressions of a life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny that to get to that point, I mean, we've talked openly about our struggles through getting through sections of this. But like when you're reading that main piece, and honestly this whole volume, it 100% feels worth it. Like,
yes, absolutely.
Just like this is a page turner in like a philosophical sense.
It's funny. A lot of this book, it feels like Proust explaining himself and explaining what he's doing.
Accurate.
Not different than, say, John Steinbeck in East of Eden, where between the chapters he'd kind of give you the moral. But this, and the way Proust does it, it feels so rich. And I don't know if it's because I've suffered so much in reading to get this far that I'm kind of a captive. But yeah, his sort of essays and explanation about what he's trying to accomplish kind of have more merit, I think, as art than maybe the descriptions of the salons themselves that are the examples of what he's describing that he's doing, and sort of placing these events outside of time and recovering time.
Yeah, I was saying before we started recording that this volume is the volume I like immediately wanted to reread. I was like, oh man, I would like to read this again, because it really gets at everything he's trying to do, and his views of art, I think, are worth wrestling with. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know are you believers in Proust's ideas of art?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, well, first off, the section earlier where he's just trashing basically the concept of just making art to advance a specific viewpoint or moral, basically the socialist realism thing. Awesome. Like, that's not what it's for. But secondly, like, I think we all have these things that we hold dear that are close to us that can immediately take you back to something. And quantifying that is kind of impossible. In my head, it must have happened in a point at which you were malleable and open to influence. But it also has something to do with like the work itself, right? Whether it's, your book, film, piece of music, pick your thing. But like that still hits. I can put on records that like were the record that I listened to all the time when I was 17 or something. And like it feels like that. Like I know the room that I was in. Like I know the car that I was driving. And like, what is that from like a quantifiable sense? And so the fact that he's putting down that idea that it is outside of intellect, it's something else that's going outside of our normal like day-to-day process of the brain. And that, I think, is the first time, or rather his description of it, right, is the first time that it has been expressed that truthfully or that fully. There's echoes of this a little bit in like W.G. Sebald, right? Gets a little bit into that. But the depth of this and like the treatment of it, I think is kind of perfect. Like, so yeah, 100% believer.
I would describe Proust is fundamentally an idealist, and he believes that consciousness is preeminent and it's sort of held in a temporary material body. and that you have access to this consciousness through your experience, through these sort of extratemporal experiences. And as such, I think you can say that he believes that you matter, that your experience is important.
Mm-hmm.
You isolated, individual, idiosyncratic, banal, you and everything that happened in your life matters, and nothing else matters, really. I think it's a really interesting read because he elevates this, and he's such a master of the language. So is our friend Terrence Kilmartin, I guess, because he translated this in English. But it's so beautiful and poetic. And I think it's easy to look at our own lives and say, like, okay, my music taste when I was in junior high was not good. It was embarrassing. That doesn't matter. Now I have achieved something. Now I've achieved social status or recognition or good taste or whatever, and now it matters. And what he's saying is that's the opposite. Society doesn't matter. What matters is that stupid, individual, meaningless thing that struck something deep in your soul, when you were a child. The sound of the bell, the taste of the Madeleine, the smell of the hawthorns. That's what matters. And that's where art comes from. It's a very beautiful idea. And I think it's easy to kind of cast that aside as simple nostalgia or sentimentality or being blind to the realities of life or whatever. I mean, it's like that's an idea that's constantly under assault by all manners of society.
What you said there made me think of, he talks about how, because he mentions near the end of the book that he knows he's going to die or feels he's going to die, and how he's no longer afraid of death because he's already died so many times. And he talks about how, so this is like near the end, like 5:15-ish, 5:16. He's talking about how his love for Albertine, he says, "Yet now I no longer loved her. I was no longer the person who loved her, but a different person who did not love her. And it was when I had become a new person that I had ceased to love her. And yet I did not suffer from having become this new person, from no longer loving Albertine. And surely the prospect of one day no longer having a body could not from any point of view seem to me as sad as had then seemed to me that one day no longer loving Albertine. That prospect which now was a fact, and one which left me quite unmoved. These successive deaths, so feared by the self, which they were destined to annihilate, so painless, so unimportant once they were accomplished, and the self that feared them was no longer there to feel them, had taught me by now that it would be the merest folly to be frightened of death." And then a little down, he says, "To me it seems more correct to say that the cruel law of art is that people die, and we ourselves die after exhausting every form of suffering, so that over our heads may grow the grass not of oblivion, but of eternal life, the vigorous and luxuriant growth of a true work of art, and so that thither, gaily, and without a thought for those who are sleeping beneath them, future generations may come to enjoy their déjeuner sur l'herbe," which is like lunch on the garden, lunch on the grass.
Which is also a painting by a famous painting by Manet, who's a constant kind of reference point in the book.
Yeah.
I also love that quote so much. I was just about to read it, but then I realized it ended in that French statement, and I didn't. That's what happened like 10 minutes ago. I was like, nope.
Déjeuner sur
You
l'herbe.
crushed it.
L'herbe.
So
I
want to put this thing back on the rails real quick because we're almost to the end.
Oh, we are.
You're already hopping to the end. So after that big section, the whole beautiful writing piece, the realization, the stepping on the stones, the Madeleines, all that stuff, he goes into the party, and then he's like, who are all these ugly old people? For like a huge section of it. Each person he meets, he's like, this person's hideous.
I thought, when he starts describing going in there, I thought that it was a party where everybody dressed up as themselves being old.
He kind of describes it like it.
What a great idea. Imagine yourself being old. I mean, have a party, invite all your friends, and say, imagine yourself as an old person.
The old version.
And you just all be old. And then
you have a funeral for the host.
You have a funeral for everybody who couldn't attend.
But he is just like unflinching. Like he just describes everybody as terrible. And I'm like, hey, there's a mirror, buddy. I don't think you're immune to this.
Well, apparently he didn't have a gray hair.
That's true. But, he had other problems. And we will get there. But I think there's a wrap up, right? You get like the where is everybody at? You see like Bloch becomes a great writer. He also changed his name, right? That kind of gets it like the some of the past like Dreyfus stuff, Swan stuff, like Jewish stuff, right? He changed his name such that he could succeed.
Did anybody else feel that Bloch and or narrator are maybe the same person? Or maybe they're two sides of Proust?
I would agree with that.
He like externalized parts so he could talk about himself?
I think that's
some aspect of himself?
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think Proust was half Jewish, right?
Yeah.
So that's very much a like
but he talks
element
about
of this.
Bloch's like insecurities and like he's very critical of him in a way that it would be easy to be critical of yourself too. Of like, oh, he's a poser, he's unoriginal. It's like that voice in your head that he kind of, I don't know, that's what I thought several times when Bloch enters the scene.
I buy it. I like it.
Your voice sounds a lot like Nick when you're not around.
We have Morel, who like is loved and super respected and everybody thinks he's great. Just, everything that you've done in the past is terrible will just get swept under the rug and you will just become a stand-up person in the future. So good news there.
Yeah, like he becomes like a hero and a politician or something at some point.
Went from past shitty dude to just great. And obviously we see that replicated throughout history. Odette is now the main squeeze of Monsieur de Guermantes, right?
She's also, her name's still Forcheville.
But she's still Forcheville, right. And then this also gets into the thing that we talked about before where the Verdurin marries into the Guermantes.
So
because the original Princess de Guermantes has passed. So
the Duke is married to Madame Verdurin?
I'm going to go with yes.
Who he hates and spends all his time with Odette.
Right, but Odette kind of hates him because he's super clingy.
Yeah.
Because Odette like still has this thing that like men desire was what I took away from it. Rachel One from the Lord is now like a super popular theater actor from her humble origins as like an experimental poet that was laughed at in these salons. Now that she's the one that calls the shots and actually uses it to kind of, influence and sway things as a form of power. I like that.
He's also really, what does he say when he enters the room? He's like, who is this hideous woman?
Yeah, right. No, he's he goes up to Gilbert and she's old and she goes, oh, you must think I'm my mom.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. He's like looking at her. He's like, I know I recognize you somewhere.
This whole thing is super bizarre, like the extent that he went through it. But it gets like this is where it gets weird.
Charlot is still around, and he's had like a really bad stroke, and is he wheeled out at some point?
I think so.
At this party, or am I thinking of earlier in the book?
I think he's somehow still kicking.
I imagined he was in the parking lot, but I guess they didn't really have parking lots.
Just screaming wildly.
Just. I don't know. Once I've seen John Malkovich as Charlot, it's like hard for me to like go back to a previous impression. Like I get it, right? Don't watch the film before you finish the book, whatever. But like it's not a bad.
Have you looked up the people that are based? Like a lot of these characters are based on actual real people for whom there exist photographs. Do you remember? Oh, what's his name? It's a phrase. He's the nephew of Combemer, I think.
The phrase.
Yeah, it's a weird phrase.
Oh, he's like referred to as like a washout. I'm a washout.
I'm a washout.
Something?
Yeah, I'm a washout.
Okay.
Do you know who I'm a washout is?
No.
Jean Cocteau.
What?
Yes. Who was friends with Proust and actually helped Proust get published initially, but then actually read it and he's like, this is not good. And then he and Proust kind of became sort of antagonistic.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then it became I'm a washout.
And then he's I'm a washout. Yeah.
That's funny.
That's awesome. All right. So approaching the creepy part where basically Proust talks about kind of wanting young women as almost sort of like a mechanism to siphon their life force. Very, very rough.
And Gilbert is going to help get him some young ladies.
And he basically kind of like propositions Gilbert to help bring him young women. And then Gilbert's like, here's my daughter, which it does not get into, like, there does not seem to be any further creepiness. But that whole section was very bizarre because then once her daughter is presented, then she becomes like the embodiment of the original topic, which is the irreconcilable nature of the Swann's way and the German way. Like, she physically embodies it because she is both. So there's sort of this beautiful encapsulating endpoint, but to get to it had this very bizarre, creepy, hey, bring me young women.
It's Paris turn of the century was I mean, I understand why people, some, more conservative bent had a bit of an icky feeling about Paris and their morals. Anything, it sounds like anything went.
So from there, now we're truly at the end. And so is our great narrator, my darling Marcel. And as he is dying, he realizes that his book is the only thing that matters and that it will live on. So he's pouring it into it as he goes throughout his memories. He's documenting as he's getting closer and closer to death. And he concludes with this statement, which is basically what you were talking about earlier, Nathan, that we have so much inside of us in terms of the spectrum of time, the spectrum of memory. And that's the thing that should be preserved. That's the thing that matters.
He has different descriptions of this, which are all awesome. But he's only he died when he was early 50s, early 40s. He wasn't an old man. And I guess, just given the structure of this novel, I gather that this party that he goes to is him coming out of having spent so much time writing. So he kind of emerges from his hermitage and sees everybody again for the first time in 15 years or something. But the passage, I really like the passage.
It is 51?
Yeah.
He was 51.
I just thought he was so young because everyone else around him was so ugly and old.
He spent all that time in the sanatorium. He's looking good.
It's true. He moisturizes.
Is this the passage near the end about the garden bell? That near there? Is that what you're looking for?
I was going to read the passage where he describes it as he feels like the painter who hikes up the hill to look down over the scene that he's going to paint. And then he realizes that the sun is already setting. I don't even know if I highlighted that one, actually.
But yeah, just the last few pages about the embodiment of time is some good stuff. I don't know if we just want to end with the end.
Read the end?
Yeah, I don't know.
I love the line, I was terrified to think that it was indeed the same bell which rang within me, and that nothing that I could do would alter its jingling notes.
Yeah. That's at 5:30?
That's 5:29.
5:29, okay.
This last section is just so good when he's kind of you just feel like there's no
it's
sense
almost
of time
like he's
anymore.
passing through to the other world.
Yeah, it's just these images kind of coming back.
Yeah.
His description of as you get old, it's like you're on stilts and the stilts just get longer and longer until you can barely balance on them anymore. And you look down and you see all these vast memories descending beneath you into the abyss.
Yeah.
That's cool.
That's pretty cool. He says, this notion of time embodied, of years past but not separated from us, it was now my intention to emphasize as strongly as possible in my work. So, he kind of sums up what he was trying to do in the work. And then, Nathan, you have the thing about the bells. Where was that at? That was really good.
It was halfway through 5:29.
And this could only be because its peal had always been there, inside me, and not the sound only, but also between that distant moment and the present one, unrolled in all its vast length the whole of that past, which I was not aware that I carried about within me. When the bell of the garden gate had pealed, I already existed, and from that moment onwards, for me still be able to hear that peal, there must have been no break in continuity, no single second in which I had ceased or rested from existing, from thinking, from being conscious of myself. Since that moment from long ago still adhered to me, and I could still find it again, could retrace my steps to it, merely by descending to a greater depth within myself. And it is because they contain thus within themselves the hours of the past that human bodies have the power to hurt so terribly those who love them, because they contain the memories of so many joys and desires already effaced for them, but still cruel for the lover who contemplates and prolongs, in the dimension of time, the beloved body of which he is jealous, so jealous that he may even wish for its destruction. For after death, time withdraws from the body, and the memories, so indifferent, grown so pale, are effaced in her who no longer exists, as they soon will be in the lover whom for a while they continue to torment, but whom before long they will perish. Once the desire that owed its inspiration to a living body is no longer there to sustain them. Yeah. And then it just keeps going. I don't know how much we can read. And I felt, as I say, a sensation of weariness and almost of terror at the thought of all this length of time had not only without interruption been lived, experienced, secreted by me, that it was my life, was in fact me, but also that I was compelled, so long as I was alive, to keep it attached to me, that it supported me, and that, perched on its giddy summit, I could not myself make a movement without displacing it. A feeling of vertigo seized me as I looked down beneath me, yet within me, as though from a height which was my own height, of many leagues, at the long series of the years. And he's just, looking back over all of his life in those final moments.
The next passage is that image that I was just describing about the stilts. I understand now why it was that Duc de Guermantes, who, to my surprise, when I had seen him sitting on a chair, had seemed to me so little aged, although he had so many more years beneath him than I had presently, when he rose to his feet and tried to stand firm upon them, swayed backwards and forwards upon legs as tottery as those of some old archbishop with nothing solid about his person but his metal crucifix, to whose support there rushes a mob of sturdy young seminarists, and had advanced with difficulty, trembling like a leaf, upon the almost unimaginable summit of his 83 years, as though men spend their lives perched upon living stilts, which never cease to grow, until sometimes they become taller than church steeples, making it in the end both difficult and perilous for them to walk, and raising them to an eminence from which suddenly they fall. And I was terrified by the thought that the stilts beneath my own feet might already have reached that height. It seemed to me that quite soon now I might be too weak to maintain my hold upon a past which already went down so far.
Woo!
Wait, there's another passage that I wanted to read. The idea of time was of value to me for yet another reason. It was a spur. It told me that it was time to begin if I wished to attain to what I had sometimes perceived in the course of my life in brief lightning flashes, on the Guermantes way and in my drives in the carriage of Madame de Villaparisis, at those moments of perception which had made me think that life was worth living. How much more worth living did it appear to me now that I seemed to see that this life that we live in half-darkness can be illumined, this life that at every moment we distort can be restored to its true, pristine shape, that a life, in short, can be realized within the confines of a book. How happy would he be, I thought, the man who had the power to write such a book. What a task awaited him. To give some idea of this task, one would have to borrow comparisons from the loftiest and the most varied arts. For this writer, who moreover must bring out the opposed facets of each of his characters in order to show its volume, would have to prepare his book with meticulous care, perpetually regrouping his forces like a general conducting an offensive. And he would have also to endure his book like a form of fatigue, to accept it like a discipline, build it like a church, follow it like a medical regime, vanquish it like an obstacle, win it like a friendship, cosset it like a little child, create it like a new world without neglecting those mysteries whose explanation is to be found probably only in worlds other than our own, and the presentiment of which is the thing that moves us most deeply in life and in art.
And so he did.
You're cut off.
Yeah, well, I think you can tell we like this book because all we want to do is find quotes from it.
Yeah, I mean, like, this probably is one of the most quotable books I can think of. It's just like throw a dart at it.
Yeah.
And like part of that is just, that's what all of Proust was, but something about this is more condensed. And I think just like the loop back of it is something that I can't think of another thing that is so capable of using the material that came before in this sort of cyclical, refreshing manner to like drive a point home further. Because going into this book, I actually thought there was nothing else to be covered. I was like, what else is he going to say? Like, I get it. Like, you're talking about memories. You're talking about all these interactions with people. Like, is this literally just going to be more, this is where these people end up, which is in there slightly. But like, the fact that he keeps that loop going and uses it to advance something even further is incredible.
It is the culmination and explication of his entire artistic endeavor.
We said earlier that sometimes it seemed like it would be nicer to read just the philosophical essay by Proust and not the quote-unquote fiction, not the plot or the salons, the plotless salons.
Are you going back on that?
Well, I don't know.
Down. No. Actually, I don't, it's hard to know if I would have appreciated this volume not having gone through the rest of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Because I still appreciated each book in its own way, and Proust always had a way of like keeping me attached, keeping me wanting to read, even though there were long insufferable moments, I thought. So it's hard to say if this book could stand alone. Like, would it be necessary to know, instead of saying a specific name, if he just said, like, a lover or a friend, a childhood friend? Like, would it make a difference?
Mm-hmm.
Probably. I think you need to go through it. It kind of adds to the appreciation of it in some way.
It gives me the feeling of having lived a life or lived alongside Proust to understand the context that he had in having these observations.
Well, he even talks about that, not to throw out another quote, but I'll just summarize it. He talks about how art does that. It allows you to live other lives. It multiplies existence.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of its purposes, or one of its purposes if done well, I guess.
It's funny, I came into recording today thinking that this would be a little bit apologetic, thinking of the positions and comments that I had made in prior episodes, and maybe wanting to take some of those back, or saying, here's what I've learned. And I think I told this anecdote, but I honestly don't remember because it's been like a year of our lives. And we've been reading all this, but I was reading like a middle volume in a bar, and the bartender was like, "Oh, you're reading Proust." And then, like, he had read it like twice, right? And so I was like, I'm over this. I'm sick of being in the middle of the Guermann way. And he told me about this piece of writing, and I forgot the title. I can't find it, but it was investigating whether or not we needed all of Proust, like how much of this could be left out. And the end comment or the end summary of it was that actually very little of it could be cut. You needed all of it. And I was like, on volume 3, and I was like, fuck that. Like, we don't need any of this. This is like way too long. And now I actually kind of agree. And so I don't know if it's it's just because you live with it so much. Do I really believe that you needed everything in the Guermann way? Like, I don't know. But like, the culmination of this does leave me with the feeling that it was worth it.
And I don't know, I found this book a lot easier to read. Like, I moved through it comfortably and enjoyably. There were very few points where I felt like I had to force myself to just keep going. Like,
because there was almost no salon.
Maybe that's why. Or maybe...
I mean, there was some of it, right?
Yeah.
It's 100 pages.
And it was mostly him trashing everybody, so it was fun.
Yeah. But I think that there's also, like, you kind of get into this Proustian rhythm.
This Proustian flow of time.
Yeah, for sure.
It's, it's kind of nice. I mean, I think I don't know if I'm going to miss reading Proust. I don't... Like, as soon as I finished War and Peace, I wanted more of those characters. I don't really feel that with Proust. I feel like he kind of like wrapped it up. But I am going to miss having his just company.
That warm comfort being by your side. Yeah, honestly, I feel the same way. And I was thinking about this with respect to the film, and I won't turn this into a film discussion because I know you guys haven't seen it, but I do recommend it. But it's an interesting choice to make an adaptation only of the last volume of a series.
Especially one that's so heavily...
Such a callback-based thing, right?
What an odd choice.
And I believe this selection was made because this does sort of reference all the prior volumes in some way, so it's kind of like the smallest section that covers everything. But I honestly don't know. Like, I was trying to think about this when I was watching it. Like, does this make sense to anyone who hasn't read all of these volumes? And I'd love somebody to comment on that. I can't now because I've read the books. But it really made me wish that there was a movie for each volume, because it was really refreshing to see like somebody's visual take on these, because the aesthetic and like trying to nail this concept of overlapping time, and also mixed with just like this very like airtight, aristocratic, like Parisian atmosphere is very Proust. Like it's pretty true to form. But I just can't imagine that it makes any sense. Like what if you read just this volume and none of the stuff before?
I still think you can get a lot out of this, but parts would be incredibly confusing.
Yeah, like all the comments of characters and people and all that. Like it's just a lot. So I don't know. Like this is all just.
But it also even confused us, as Nathan's occasional interruptions at the beginning of the episode demonstrated. Wait, who? The actress? Huh? Who's married?
Maybe she was. Honestly, that sounds kind of familiar. Maybe Leia was an actress.
I'll say it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that is the true. Yeah, but like the whole point is, I think I'm coming to the conclusion that I agree with this general statement that like it's all important, much in the way of like the general end point of the book of we all had these experiences, we all had all of these minutes that we passed through or passed through us, depending on how you visualize time. All of that did happen. And so in an effort to try to cover all of that is fascinating. Like it's unparalleled, right? And like, who am I to say what will stick with other people, I think is the point. Like I remember stuff, but like it's all based on what you connect with. Like our memories are copies of our previous memories. So like, do you remember the same stuff in volume 2 that I do? I doubt it. Do I remember anything from volume 2? I also doubt it. But like, it is this sort of warm comfort to like have somebody lead you through all of that while also just being very direct. And this is what this book is doing. This is the art that I'm making. This is why I'm making it. Like there's no tricks, right? There's no like, well, I don't know, Nathan, you're always the symbolism guy. But like to me, this is like very straightforward. It's just like, here is the art. Well, but I'm sure somebody's commenting on symbolism and themes and allegories and stuff within this. I don't know.
It almost seems like what he really wanted to do was write philosophy. I mean, he really wanted to express very clearly this idea about what it means to exist, what it means to be conscious of your existence. And so, yeah, I don't think that he's really hiding any of that.
Yeah, he's not super concerned with burying it in anything.
Yeah.
Because why should you?
It's very interesting. I mean, I really liked the way he started this book with that passage of like, here's another way that I could have written these salon scenes. This is the way that you would, if you were alive then, this is the way you would likely have read these salon scenes. And that suddenly, it became interesting to me suddenly, because this was sort of a counter narrative to the way that people were being talked about, to the way that society was being talked about. It's banal. These people are idiots, or they're just people, and some of them are idiots and some of them are vain. But if you try to place them within a broader narrative, whatever that is, of the war or Dreyfusism or aristocracy, gossip, whatever that narrative structure that you place them within to, then you cut out the stuff that doesn't fit into that. You try to make, Cotard actually be the intelligent doctor and not the goofball with all the dad jokes, because he may be a brilliant doctor, but at the salon, that's not the way he appears. He appears to be just a buffoon who tells stupid jokes, and it's kind of awkward. And Brichot isn't, a brilliant scholar. He's a pedant, and that's the way they actually are. But if you have an idea about, I need to believe in this, I need to believe in these symbols or this pre-existent narrative, then you will go in and you will see that, and you will read that, and you will receive that. And he kind of demolishes that. And I think that to some degree, because I don't know about y'all, I was not familiar with this style of writing, or I have not read, accounts of French salons or whatever. So it didn't seem to me reading all, the previous volumes, that it was doing something that was new to me. I think maybe we've gotten used to that idea of it being a very blunt, kind of untranslated reflection of, quote unquote reality.
I don't know where this is going or how we're going to end this. Does anyone know how to end this?
Does Proust?
Yeah.
I thought he ended it well.
Touche.
I mean, how do you feel about being done with this? You have this is a sort of monumental achievement to have read all of this.
Who are you going to tell about this, and will they care?
Only a handful of people, and no one will care.
Ask me about Proust.
Yeah.
I think it's more of like, I mean, we did space this out a little bit, right? So we didn't read this straight through. Probably could have done it in half the time at pretty steady pace, but
I don't know that I could have. I was at top speed.
I believe you could.
10 pages a day for a
speed.
year and a half. That's about as fast as I can read Proust.
All right. Well, okay. That was presumptuous of me. But my point where I'm going with this, it is a finite amount of time. You are actually a different person when you started it. Like, I have had like a couple different things happen in my life. And to know that this general concept that I like to think through, which is like you can read a book when you're X age and then you read it 10 years later and 10 years after that. And that is a fixed piece in the, sea of time. And you're the person that's changing. You're the thing that's in movement. And so you can have a different perception of that. But I like that because this is so long and has so much depth to it, it sort of obscures that concept that you are a single point in time. You're almost moving with it because it takes such a long effort to get through. And that I think is fascinating because I don't want to say that like we're completely different after a year, but you're a little different. Something has happened. Something has changed. You probably have a different perspective on something. Like we're all further into the abyss.
And how much has living with Proust almost every day changed the way you've thought about things? I've thought about this a lot. Like I get into the narrators of books and it influences my thinking patterns. I don't know if you feel that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, this, similar to, what's his face, Sebald, has forced me to sort of get stuck in memory loops more.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just start like focusing on things. And then I'll start, especially with Proust, I'll start analyzing how much of this memory is real. What have I remembered incorrectly? What have I added to the memory that has become permanent? That probably wasn't there, and little things like that. And then I think about how I would describe them if I had to, and did anything change? Like, because even the narrator notices himself at one point reflecting back on a memory of himself and going, "Holy shit, I really haven't changed actually that much. How fucking depressing is that?" Especially as an adult. Like, you can look back on memories of your youth, but there comes a point, once you hit like 30 and you look back on years of your life and you're like, oh, like little things have changed, of course, but I keep doing the same dumbass shit I was doing 10, 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it sort of forces that reflection.
I think there's a different element of time to this, and it's the reader's interaction with it and their own time as they go through Marcel time. I think those are not, it's not like an intersection. It's not like, you experience this at blank point. It has that, and it has those loop backs, and as also a challenge to your own memory to process somebody else trying to process what memory means. Like, it's just cool. It's just cool, and there's nobody to talk about it IRL. Nobody wants to talk to you about Proust. Thanks for listening. You can find out more about us at booksofsomesubstance.com and on Twitter and Instagram with the handle BooksOSubstance. And if you do head on over to our website, make sure you check out our store, which has new, cool Proust-themed merch, which you can use to identify other Proust lovers out in the wild. And as always, if you can click things, subscribe buttons, like buttons, leave reviews, that really helps. We appreciate everything you do. Until next time, happy reading.
I can't breathe through my nose, so it's going to be...
Like you don't know how?
No, I never learned. Always been a mouth breather.